with people being in contract on closings and this pandemic obviously being let's call it a once in a lifetime event or unforeseen event or whatever, if somebody were to lose deposit, a deal, money for something unforeseen, and like the other side is like super strict and like whatever, if they turned around and came back and like brought it to court and sued, in your opinion, I know you've no way of knowing, do you think there's any leniency that courts are going to give because of what's going on despite how the contract is written? Or do you think most are going to be like, hey, the contract's the contract, you know, you should have had something in there for this?
It's a good question, and I've been asked it probably 20 or 30 times over the past couple of weeks. There are a lot of time provisions for acts of God. I don't know that this qualifies as an act of God. It's not a natural, I mean, depending on who you ask, I guess. I don't know that it's a natural disaster. I've had a lot of people that have asked me this thing, and there's also a provision called force majeure, which means it is what it is. Meaning, obviously, there was an outside circumstance that caused you not to be able to get financing or not to be able to close. So because of that, under the laws of equity, it's the right thing to do to give the down payment back. I would have to imagine, and again, of course, I don't know. I would have to imagine that a court would take that into consideration when making a decision as to whether this buyer loses their down payment. It wasn't, it's going to be fact specific. It wasn't necessarily that buyer's fault. But, at the same time, these things happen on a somewhat regular basis anyway, without this natural disaster. So it's always, if you get typically it's not contingent on financing and you wind up not closing, either by the closing date in the contract or, if the seller needs an extension, whatever the ultimate closing date is, typically the seller is allowed to keep the down payment as what's called liquidated damages, which means this is the money that they get for their time that was wasted because they had their property off of the market and you wound up not closing. So it's going to be interesting to see. I know that it's actually interesting. Probably 2 weeks ago, New York State Association of Realtors, NYSAR, they actually came out with something called the Corona Addendum that I've seen come through on a couple of contracts, and I paraphrased it and I took some pieces out of it. But basically what it says is that if a buyer is unable to close because of something related to the coronavirus, or if there are unforeseen delays, it kind of is what it is and you have to let it go. And if they're not able to get their financing, they have their financing and they lose it, then you need to let them out of the deal.
It's crazy because I was talking to a buddy of mine yesterday, and literally for the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, it's just been it's call after call with everybody
Yeah.
And Chris, even on, we have a deal we're selling, and the buyers, they can't close, and they were supposed to close in March before this really happened. They took an extension into April, and then yesterday they need an extension to May. They've just been a miserable group to work with, and we're not going to give them their deposit back. But then you hear something like that, and I was talking to my buddy yesterday, and he used the exact same thing. He said, listen, is it going to qualify or not? He said, it's really in the hands of the guy behind the judge that looks at the case. If he's having a good day, bad day, he's going to make a decision. So your contract could be rock solid, but this is such a, it's not an act of God. I don't think it would qualify for under that.
I don't
that whole force majeure thing is something that is going to be the defensive, so it's like the flavor of the week. But, we also know that they can't close, forget a Corona. They don't have the money for it. So but they're going to spin it in another way. But it's just interesting when, from the legal standpoint, we sit here and we're like, we got a rock solid case. And what do I always say, even, for, you get into things and just get into arguments. Yeah. We always ask our attorneys, what do you think? In your way, he's like, listen, if I was on the buy side, I definitely would, I would be blaming it on something. If I'm on the sell side, I'd be trying to keep the money. So it's, you could easily, if you have a client buying, you're going to take his side. If you have a client selling, you're going to take his side.
That's, that's the attorney's job. I mean, at the end of the day, and I tell clients this all the time, because everyone, whenever they hear, if they don't close, I can keep their down payment. Maybe, But the contract is only as strong as the person that's willing to enforce it. So if you keep someone's down payment, okay, and at the end of the day, that buyer sues you, okay, and depending on what the contract says, or depending on what the judge decides, you may then be responsible for that buyer's legal fees if you didn't act in good faith. There's lots of different pieces to the puzzle. It's not usually as perfect as, oh, he defaulted. Buyers don't usually walk away from their deposits without fighting, unless we're talking about a minimal amount of money and they just write it off as a cost of doing business and go on to the next. And that's what a lot of investors do. A lot of investors, they put down as little as possible. And as a buyer's attorney, I always want to put down as little as possible because that's, the least exposure you can have. And so sometimes I had one last week where my client was assigning and her end buyer wound up losing his financing. His deal wasn't contingent. His down payment was, I think, $3,000. So, he wrote it off. It's cost of doing business, and he's going to go on to the next. My client will, keep that, and she's going to lose a piece of her down payment because she didn't close either. So, it's the way it goes a lot of times, depending on how much money you have down.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we see that a lot when you get up more into like the institutional space. The deposits get significantly bigger. Like there's one specific deal we looked at. It was like a 20-something million dollar deal, and they wanted close to $1 million in deposit money down, just because it was, they wanted someone with discretionary capital. They didn't want to mess around. Pricing was important because it was just the submarket, but they were like, anybody too small, just don't even bother. Like, we don't want to take the chance. So, it's, everybody wants to talk about price. There's a lot more to offers than I think just pricing, which
of course.